Today we're going to talk about political participation, and what we really mean is how people actually can participate in our government. And we all know that the most common form of participation in our government, we should know hopefully, is voting. But really today we're going to focus more on ways that you can participate in the government and beyond voting. So our central question today is going to be, other than voting, how do Americans participate in the political process? So first of all, it's important to understand what we mean by participation. It doesn't mean just actively going to a government event. Rather, participation simply means the influence or support of a government action or decision. So anytime that people in our country try to influence a government decision, they try to sway a government decisions, excuse me guys, or if they try to support or oppose a government decision, that's participation. So voting is obviously a form of participation because when you vote, you are telling the government whether or not you support an elected official or an actual policy idea. However, there are other methods, and we're going to categorize these in two different ways. We're going to categorize participation by conventional and unconventional. And by conventional, you see here what we mean, and we're focused right here on conventional participation. What we mean is the acceptance of existing institutions. And by the word institution right here, what I mean is a process already established by the government. So if you're going to participate conventionally in the government, you are using means that have been established by the government for that participation. So if you're going to influence the government, you're doing so in a way that is accepted already by the government. Conventional participation is also considered supportive, meaning it's a method of supporting what our government does. It's not very defiant, or it doesn't go against the current process of the government. So really, conventional participation, another way of looking at this, is looking at the idea that it's a way of participating by the methods that are already given to us by the government. The government establishes voting days and voting criteria and voting situations and elected officials that we vote for. Those are methods or institutions by which the government has already established that we can participate in. So the government says, hey, you can tell us what you think by going to vote. That makes it conventional. Another form of participation, and we'll just get rid of that here, and we'll look now at unconventional participation, and that's challenging. You want to think about unconventional being defiant. It is challenging the existing institution of our government. It's threatening. It's more defiant, meaning it's opposing what the government's doing, but it's not just because you can oppose in conventional participation, but in unconventional, you are opposing in a way that's disruptive to the society or disruptive to the means and methods that the government has established for participation. So we're going to look first at unconventional participation at some examples. Unconventional participation, we mean an example here is protest. As you can see on the left side of the screen, you can see the picture here of a protest, a historic protest in the American government. So violent and nonviolent protests are both unconventional. And, typically you're going to immediately think violent is the most unconventional method of protest. But however, nonviolent also is as well, because it's disruptive. And also the government's not establishing a situation where it says, hey, you can go protest here. And since it's not establishing that channel or that institution, that's what makes it unconventional. People just stand up and do that themselves. Now you want to remember that the First Amendment does allow protest. However, it's not established by the government. So just so we have the freedom of speech and the ability to do so, means it still can make that form of participation unconventional. And you want to see here your focus, obviously, unconventional. Another example, civil disobedience. That's peaceful protest. It's simply what civil disobedience means. It's a form of protest in which you are non-violently and really without breaking the law standing up and saying something, but you have to remember it's still disruptive. A really good example of civil disobedience in our history is during the civil rights movement, and you had African Americans sit in on lunch counters. When they weren't allowed to sit at certain lunch counters, they would sit, and they weren't hurting anybody, but they weren't following a law. The law actually said they couldn't go there, and they just very peacefully sat in a place where they were illegal to be there. Same thing as the bus riders, the people that rode on public buses to to protest against peacefully the fact that African Americans weren't allowed to ride on certain bus routes or in certain parts of the bus. All of that is still unconventional because the government's not establishing a method or a way for those people to speak out in that way. They're doing so peacefully, but they're still breaking the law. And the other really big key thing to unconventional is it's challenging. I used the word defiant earlier, but another thing you can look at is it's challenging our current existing government methods, our current government institutions, our current way of running our government. All of that would be unconventional. Whereas conventional, voting, campaigning, doing anything that the government says this is allowed to do and this is the way you can do it. So the government creates campaign laws. There's campaign finance laws giving limits to certain donations that we can and can't make. Since it's run by the government, it's conventional. But you want to remember, and the key thing to this presentation here, and also to the activity we're going to do in class following, is that it goes well beyond voting. That conventional participation is not simply voting. It's actually the most common form, and actually not really well used in the United States. Persuading the government is another example. Another example of conventional, it would be going to the courts and actually suing one person or another for, or suing the government, let's say, if you think your right's been violated by a certain part of your government. Bringing that lawsuit forward in our government is actually conventional because we've established a way to do that. We've said, hey, if you want to protest, if you have an issue with the way the government's running and you think it's illegal what they're doing or unconstitutional, you certainly can bring that forward legally through the court systems. So you're thinking here with conventional about using the proper channels. You also want to think another way of looking at conventional is looking at the fact that it's routine. There's a routine already established for this participation, which makes it conventional. Typically, conventional is more supportive of the government, but it doesn't have to be. And the other thing, typically, people in higher socioeconomic statuses are most often the ones that are practicing your conventional participation. I'm actually going to back up for a second, back to unconventional for just a moment. I want to think about another example that I think you guys are more familiar with, and that's going to be the Boston Tea Party. Is another example of unconventional. So I'm just going to write here B, Boston Tea Party, for you guys to think about. So the Boston Tea Party was certainly not something that the British government had put up and said, hey, you guys can dump tea in the Boston Harbor to promote our taxes and our laws on tea. That certainly was not a channel or an appropriate method as established by the government at that time. However, that was what the colonists felt was necessary to get their voice out. It was defiant. It was disruptive. A lot of people probably disapproved of that action. However, it still was a way of influencing the government really in that way by opposing what the government was doing. Typically, your unconventional participation is going to be more uncommon. It's going to be one where many people might disapprove of people doing that. I've already said before, it's often threatening, defying traditional channels. Sometimes it involves destruction of property, like it did in the case of the Boston Tea Party. And sometimes it even involves physical violence. So now, just to sum up and to actually finish this presentation, this one's going to be a really short one. These are examples actually from your book, from your reading, and I want you guys to take a minute and think about, are these examples conventional or unconventional? So as I highlight, if you guys can follow along with me, that would be great. So I'm going to keep the highlighter, and I want you to think about the first one. Mrs. Jones of Iowa City goes to a neighbor's living room to attend her local precinct's presidential caucus. Presidential caucus is one way of a political party nominating candidates to run for them in the general election. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to think about that. That going and taking part in that primary process, would that be conventional or unconventional? The next one, and I'm going to go through all these in just a minute, but I'm going to go and read them out loud. I want you guys to write down, ideally, what you think these things are as we're going through this. Demonstrators against abortion protests at the Supreme Court. So people that are against abortion, they're protesting in the anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, which is the one that established the legality of abortion throughout the United States. The third one, get rid of these. The parents in Alabama file a lawsuit to oppose a textbook that is promoting a certain type of secular humanism. So really the focus here is the lawsuit. Is that lawsuit conventional or unconventional? And then finally, a Social Security recipient writes a letter to a senator to express concern. Writing a letter to your government official, is that going to be conventional? Meaning, is that going to go through the routine channels of our government, or is that going to be unconventional and more defiant? So let's go back through these. Let's change the pen. And I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to write a U next to unconventional and a C next to conventional to make sure you guys got this right. So going to the presidential caucus, the first one, guys, that's going to be conventional. Going to protest, and your key word here is protest at the Supreme Court, that's going to be unconventional. Filing a lawsuit on the third example, conventional. And writing a letter to your senator is going to be also conventional. So we're going to do some more with this, where we actually look at some primary documents in history of conventional and unconventional participation. And then eventually, when we finish looking at those documents, when we get back into class, we're going to also answer this question, this question, which is actually a free response question that we're going to work on together in class. So identifying two forms of participation in the government. You can use conventional or unconventional for this one, and explaining two advantages of each form. Once we look at the documents first, we're going to be able to explain the advantages of conventional and unconventional participation, because they both have their advantages. Both conventional and unconventional have their advantages in our political system. So going back, let's just backtrack real quick to the first page and make sure that we know, other than voting, how do we participate in our political process. At this point, you guys should know that we can participate conventionally, or through routine channels or routine institutions of our government, and we can also participate unconventionally, which is going to be more defiant and not following the established system in our government. If you have any questions, please let me know the next day in class. And thank you very much, guys.